here for our second discussion of Beowulf, which is pretty much the second half of the epic poem, but there are a few spots that you didn't need to read. I put an image up here because I wanted to remember to, well, first I wanted to give you some visuals, but also I wanted to remember to talk about a few things. In this section, we have two more battles that Beowulf has. So in some ways, the second half is more exciting than the first half. They let you skip over some of the stuff that you would probably call boring, or people would probably call boring. Some of the background stuff and some repetitive things. I'm going to summarize those things quickly. I'm not going to dwell on them since you didn't read them, but I will summarize them. But the first battle of this section is, of course, the fight that Beowulf has with Grendel's mother. Now, Grendel's mother, we don't know what she looks like. We know she has talons because she uses them. And so the depiction of Grendel's mother varies, just like it varies of Grendel. Grendel's physical description isn't really described either. He has arms and legs, we know that. So they're sort of humanoid forms. But other than that, artists and your own imagination can fill in the blanks on that. Maybe that's even more frightening if you get to use your own imagination to make the worst possible creatures. Of course, Beowulf has one last battle in his old age, and that's depicted down here with the dragon. And we're going to talk about those two today. I also wanted to include some images from an archaeological excavation that demonstrate some of the riches and the jewelry and armor and things like that would have been appropriate for the time period that we're talking about and Anglo-Saxon people that we're talking about. After Beowulf defeats Grendel, he gets a lot of treasure. And again, when he defeats Grendel's mother, he gets a lot of treasure from Hrothgar. And so I just thought that I would put the image of this torque. Walchtheo gives him a torque, which is a neck piece. And this is not necessarily exactly what Beowulf would have received, but it's a torque. And then over here is an Anglo-Saxon helmet. We have these from an excavation called Sutton Hoo, Sutton, capital Hoo, which is a burial site where they buried an entire longship, a Viking longship, along with many treasures and probably some people. And so we do have some of the treasures of the Anglo-Saxon people, and I just thought that you might want to have a little look at those as sort of a representation of something that Beowulf might have received from Hrothgar. All right, I'm going to switch over to my PDF here and start going through the text for today. If you have questions, please go ahead and put them up in the chat. If I skip something that you wanted to ask about, then please definitely put a note there. I'm not touching on everything you need to know about Beowulf. I'm mainly just hitting the major stuff and making a few points. So make sure that you've read the assigned parts. Oh, I know what I was going to start with. I was going to start with the background reading for the Middle Ages. So let me start there before I get into the Beowulf stuff. Also for today, you're supposed to read a little bit of Middle Ages background. There's a summary here of about, I don't know, 20 some pages from the textbook about the Middle Ages. Maybe reading this little summary, this is prepared by the English department at STC, but maybe reading this kind of jogged your memory from your history classes. There is a midterm for this exam in March. So there are questions about the historical elements, and there are questions, of course, also about the material that we're reading. You'll notice that when some of the text is referenced here, there are some bullet points. So I added those because the midterm exam is from the department is set up in a way that I want you to know now how it works. Just so that to help you prepare your notes and to prepare for when you take that. So the midterm exam has multiple sections, but in the final two, they will give you like I think 15 different terms or names of people or concepts, and you will need to write a short response explaining the significance of that element, the time period that it's emphasized, and so on. The thing is that it's set up to rotate and sort of randomly give you terms out of maybe 40 or so different ones. And so there's no way of knowing which 15 or how many ever, I don't remember if it's 15 or 10 or 20, because I didn't write the exam. So it's coming from a bank of 40. And if you don't know all 40, then you're at a disadvantage for whatever 15 pop out when you take your exam randomly. So when I put these bullets here, know that I'm doing that because I've already isolated the terminology that may show up on the exam. So in these preliminary readings, when you're doing your notes on them, keep in mind that I've already filtered the material to reflect the things that you need to know for the midterm. So when we have this list of items here, that's why I was mentioning the other day ENGL, because I know that it's a possibility that that term could come up on your midterm. And so I make sure that I bring it up. I make sure that it's in your reading or in some sort of notes that you're supposed to take, or I mention it in these discussion lectures. So just keep in mind that these items would be good to pay attention to, dates, things like that in these little summaries. If you feel like these summaries aren't enough, you can go back and read these 22 pages in the textbook on the history of the Middle Ages. I don't think it's necessary. I think it's clear to you that I'm pulling out from the textbook what you need to know for the midterm. I think I made that kind of clear, but there's also some stuff on here for the next two pieces that we're going to read, Gawain and the Green Knight and the Canterbury Tales. So those are coming up. We're going to be moving into the Middle Ages on Thursday. On Thursday, we're going to talk about the first section of Gawain. So these terms, I'll probably mention them on Thursday and the following Tuesday. So, okay, now we can go back over to Beowulf. I just didn't want to forget to underscore the importance of reading that background historical information. Okay, so we left off on Thursday at the point in Beowulf where Beowulf has just defeated Grendel in the Mead Hall in Denmark, and he has displayed the arm there, and then there's a spot that you can skip. And the section is called Celebration at Harrett. And what happens in this section is obviously they have a big old party for Beowulf. They're super proud of the fact that he was able to defeat and kill this demon, Grendel. And so they describe that he went back to his lair and died. And everybody in the mead hall decides to have a big old party, and they bring out all kinds of food and drink, and Hrothgar hosts Beowulf and his men in this glorious celebration. And a lot of things happen in that celebration that I'll just kind of go over in case you wanted to fill in your notes on that. So they bring in a minstrel, and the minstrel, like, would be normal for them for entertainment, and the minstrel sings two songs. One is the song of Sigmund, who was a dragon killer, and we think that the reason that they did that is not only to keep the story of Sigmund alive, but also to kind of compare Beowulf to Sigmund. Beowulf killed Grendel, who was not a dragon, but they're kind of saying, oh, you're our new hero and you're equal to Sigmund, so we're going to honor you by singing this story about our great dragon killer for you at tonight's festivities. You can tell when they do that because there's like different font text. So there'll be like this italicized version of the text and then these strange gaps. This is called a caesura in poetry. And it helps the person who's singing remember the lines because they're, you know, kind of like in chunks. But this demonstrates that story. So they sing that story to honor him. Hrothgar shows up and gives him all kinds of gifts, gold and horses and chainmail and armor and all kinds of flags and different things to honor him for his defeat of Grendel. And they sing another song. This is where it talks about the victory gift and so on. They sing another song that is a little more of a foreshadowing song. And it's the song called the Finn Saga. And so to keep their history alive, they sing it, but also it foreshadows the coming of Grendel's mother. It's a story about like sadness and revenge because there's this character, Hildebert, who's a Danish princess, and she goes off to get married. They marry her off to Finn, who is a Frisian, and they're trying to, it's like a treaty between the two countries, Denmark and Friesland, and it doesn't work. She gets married off to him to bring the countries, you know, some peace. But when her brother comes to visit, he instigates a war, and Hildebert loses her husband, her brother, and her son, all in this skirmish. So it's about her, and even though it's called the Finn Saga, it's about her and the grief that she endures because of the revenge that happens. And so that's piggybacks a little bit off of Grendel's mother, right? The idea that Grendel's mother goes to get revenge for the death of her son, and you know, the grief just continues. She's grief fueled as she goes to enact her revenge. She's grief fueled when she's fighting Beowulf, and so this historical insert kind of mirrors what's happening in the later part and foreshadows the attack of Grendel's mother and the ensuing events. But you can see this is the same thing. It's set up with this italicized text and the line breaks or the caesura there so that you know that the minstrel is singing as entertainment and to get the history another place in their literature. The queen comes in, Welsh Theo, she gives Beowulf something to drink. She gives him a golden torque as a gift here on line 1216. So she gives him gifts, Hrothgar gives him gifts, you know, he gets all these gifts. I should point out that he's not going to keep these gifts. They're given to him, but he's going to take them back and give them to his king as, you know, a tribute. So when he gets back to Geatland, he's going to just, you know, talk about his victories, but then he's going to give all of the treasure to his king, which is what he would be expected to do. The king's going to give him what he thinks Beowulf deserves, but by doing that, he demonstrates his worth to his kingdom and to his uncle and his king as a producer of wealth for their civilization. So it says that he's giving it to him, and he is, but Beowulf is going to turn around. I mean, how many suits of armor do you need, and how many horses, and all those things? So Beowulf's going to turn around and give them to the kingdom to enrich his people. Okay, so right at the end of that section that you skipped over is more foreshadowing. I would say foreshadowing is foreshadowing and flashback really are one of the most prominent tools that we see in Anglo-Saxon literature. In this case, as they're partying it up after the victory of Grendel, because they don't know about Grendel's mother, they're drunk and, you know, celebrating. There's this line that foreshadows the attack of Grendel's mother, and it says, she moved then to her place. They're talking about Welsh Theo. Men were drinking wine at that rare feast. How could they know fate, the grim shape of things to come, the threat looming over many thanes as night approached and King Hrothgar prepared to retire to his quarters? So it says, even as they were celebrating this first victory that very night, they didn't know that hanging over them was this next attack by Grendel's mother. So foreshadowing is a key feature. Then a part that you were supposed to read is another attack, and this part describes the attack of Grendel's mother. I'm hoping that while you were reading that part, you were kind of comparing the battle that Beowulf had with Grendel versus the battle that he had with Grendel's mother. The situation, the scenario, the setup, the reason why they're fighting, and compare and contrast those, because it's definitely a level up situation. He defeated Grendel, but after we read about how he defeated Grendel's mother, we kind of move Beowulf up even further in the legendary status because his fight with her is more difficult in a couple different ways, and he barely comes out of it. So the fact that he wins that one really solidifies his legendary status. And how it happens is Grendel's mother is very upset. She was there, obviously, when Grendel made it back to their underwater lair. And so she goes to get revenge to the mead hall. And there's this description of her brooding on her wrongs and deciding that she's going to go and do something about it out of the area of the King's clan where they all sort of intermix in this wretched kind of um, location. And you get this description of her coming to Harrot, and everybody's drunk and asleep, and they think they're safe now because Grendel's been destroyed, but they didn't know about Grendel's mother, and here she is to exact her revenge. And there's this description of it that I want to point out because there's a mythological allusion that I don't want you to miss. And I don't know, I wish we had a whole class on mythology. Like they could be freshman English, could just all be mythology as far as I'm concerned. But in any case, there's this reference to Grendel's mother entering the mead hall, and it says her onslaught was less only by as much as an Amazon warrior's strength is less than an armed man when the hefted sword, its hammered edge and gleaming blade slathered in blood, raises the sturdy boar ridge off of a helmet. So they're comparing Grendel's mother to an Amazon warrior. And I want to talk a little bit about that comparison and that mythological allusion, because maybe you know about Amazons and maybe you don't. And it's worth talking about. It's a good little side story. So in popular culture, if you have seen the Wonder Woman movies, they play on the fact that Wonder Woman is an Amazon, and it's sort of like a modern, tamer version of Amazons compared to the mythological ones. But if you've seen that, it's a society of all women, and the Amazons were all women, and they were all warriors. Nobody gets to sit down and be a seamstress or whatever. Everybody's a warrior in that mythological society. And they're all fierce warriors. They're so fierce that their own physical persona is less important than their ability to fight using multiple weapons. So the Amazons are so fearsome that as they grow up and learn their weapons, this is in myth, as they find that they're growing into maturity, the young ladies will understand this. There's certain hindrances that grow on their bodies that make it difficult for them to employ some weapons. If you've ever tried to hit a golf ball or a baseball with a bat or anything like that, the young ladies will know, and I'm sure the young gentlemen can understand, that there's a little something that gets in the way. My niece is 12 and she would call them chesticles. And so it inhibits your range of motion if you're doing any of those things. Guys probably don't think about that. But the Amazons did, and because one of their breasts got in the way, they cut it off. and just went on with life. They left the other one because they needed to nurture their children. But they just, because it got in the way of them, you know, shooting their arrows or throwing their javelin or whatever, they just removed it from their bodies. That's fierce number one. Fierce number two is that they were a society of all women. So they did not suffer the intrusion of anyone, but especially uh, patriarchal societies. They did end up producing more children. I mean, they need to continue their race. So you're wondering, well, how does that happen if they're a race of all women? They would attack villages and areas and sex up the men, impregnate themselves, and go back to their society and either kill the men that they left behind or enslave them. And then they would give birth. And if it was a boy, they killed it. This is not real. This is a myth. So I don't want you to worry about real babies being slaughtered. It's mythological story. But that's fierce number two, right? That they wanted a female society so prevalently that they just felt the worth of these boy children as insignificant. And so they destroyed them. So yeah, creatures like that, women like that are pretty fearsome. And so when Grendel's mother is compared to an Amazon warrior in that little description, all that stuff's supposed to come into play, right? It's supposed to play on your mind all the, you know, fierce qualities of the Amazonian myth. So she is coming to the hall to get her revenge, and she does. She grabs up a bunch of men, and they woke up. And when they wake up, she panics, and she had one guy in her clutches. It turns out he was a really important guy, and she runs out with him. And it turns out that he was Hrothgar's really close advisor, Ashera. So she leaves and she goes running back to her lair. She's got like, she's sort of ripping and eating Ashera as she goes. So there's pieces of him that are kind of, you know, in a trail with her footsteps. And she goes back to her lair. Beowulf and Hrothgar were not present when that happened. So there's a note here on line 1321 that Hrothgar and Beowulf arrive at the mead hall to figure out what's going on. And that's when Hrothgar realizes that his closest advisor, Ashera, is the one who has been murdered by Grendel's mother. And his reaction is just pure grief. He says, "Rest, what is rest? Sorrow has returned. Alas for the Danes, Ashera is dead." Basically, we didn't even have a whole day to celebrate our freedom from Grendel, and now we're under attack again, and the worst has happened. My advisor has been attacked. And he talks about how much he was close to this guy. He says he was a soulmate and a right-hand man. Now, soulmate, you don't need to read that like it's 2021. You read that like it's, you know, 750. He just means it's a person who understood me, helped me through all of my decisions and all of that stuff. So he's clearly upset about the fact that his advisor has been slaughtered, and he starts talking about where Grendel's mother must be, and he talks about their possible location in the moors. So it's sort of like out in this abandoned area that's kind of desolate, and there's this murky, swampy area, and they live underneath there in the fens, in this underwater cave. And so he says, "I've heard that there are creatures out there. Maybe that's where she's from." And then he challenges Beowulf and says, "Look, if you dare, why don't you go see if you can get her?" He understands that Beowulf will be facing a different challenge. He says, "The gap of danger where the demon waits is still unknown to you," meaning the gap of danger is literal and also figurative. So the gap of danger is literally the place where she exists. He's never been there. Nobody's ever seen under there. Beowulf doesn't even know what Grendel's mother looks like because he wasn't there when she attacked. So the gap of danger is also a sense. So the difficulty in fighting her, that gap between the known and the unknown, is significant. And so it says, seek it if you dare. If you take up this challenge, I will compensate you. Basically, I'll give you more gold and more stuff. And of course, in the next part, Beowulf immediately takes up that challenge. Why? Well, he wants his fame to live on, and he is trying to make a name for himself. And you can't do that by just killing one monster. If you want people to sing a song about you and write your story down, you probably have to do multiple great feats. So Beowulf comes back at Hrothgar and agrees that he will go after Grendel's mother wherever she is, but he also gives this little lecture to Hrothgar. I don't know if you caught it, but he kind of talks down to Hrothgar, or at least tries to remind him of his position as a king, which a younger man would not normally do, right? He has to remind Hrothgar that revenge is better than mourning. Don't cry. He says, wives, sir, do not grieve. It's always better to avenge dear ones than to indulge in mourning. We all know that we're going to die. So he's sort of counseling Hrothgar to not be so visibly upset about the death of his advisor. I'm going to go and find her wherever she is. She can't hide. I'm going to get revenge. Wergild over here. I'm going to get the price for your advisor. But then he says, she'll have nowhere to fear to endure your troubles today, bear up and be the man I expect you to be, which is something that you, like a parent would say to a child, right? Suck it up, man up. You need to be a king for your people. Your people don't need to see you whimpering and wailing over there in the corner. They need, a strong persona to lead them. And usually it's the older person who says that to the younger person. And in this case, it's reversed. Beowulf's reminding him of that role. So that's worth mentioning. So almost immediately, they go traipsing off through the forest, and they go to this location that Hrothgar says is a bunch of strange creatures hang out there, and maybe that's where they live. And they get to it, and the water, like, it's disgusting. The water is like, there's all these cliffs, and the water is like roiling with body parts and gore and blood and serpents and all kinds of stuff. And so they stand there looking at it, all these men, and they shoot an arrow at it to see what's going to happen and so on. But Beowulf just starts putting on his gear. That's another difference between the first battle with Grendel and the second one. In the first battle, Beowulf says, I'm going to fight Grendel the way he fights. And they ended up, with hand to hand, grappling. In this one, because the territory is unknown, he doesn't know Grendel's mother, what she looks like or anything. He puts on his gear. He puts on all of his mail. He puts on his plate armor. And it's a good thing that he does, because he would have died immediately if he hadn't done that. So he puts on all of his protection, and he has a few things happen before he jumps in. First of all, Unferth gives him his family sword, and that's supposed to kind of mend the bad feelings from the feast that they had when Beowulf first arrived to take care of Grendel. That sword doesn't do him any good because it snaps almost immediately, but it's a gesture. And the second thing is that Beowulf tells Hrothgar that if I don't make it out, can you please make sure that, he says right here on line 1480, if this combat kills me, take care of my young company, my comrades in arms, and be sure also, my beloved Hrothgar, to send Higelac the treasures I received. In other words, if I don't make it out, can you look after my men, take care of my duties, and make sure my king gets the treasure? So his awareness of his mortality is clear. He knows that by jumping in there, it's a coin toss whether he's going to make it out. But he just blindly jumps into that environment, not knowing what he's going to encounter at all. And so that's why I say it's sort of a level up situation from the fight with Grendel. The fight with Grendel was in human territory. It wasn't his meat hall, but it was human territory. And now he's just jumping into the unknown. And that's like, you know, a notch up or 10 notches up on the hero meter. So he jumps in, and almost immediately Grendel's mother finds him and starts lashing at him. She's got these talons, right? These bird-like claws, and she starts snatching at him as he's like sinking through the water. She comes to him and she just starts pulling at him. Well, he's wearing his chainmail, so he's protected from that. If he didn't have the chainmail, he would have been gone right away. She pins him down. She's able to attack him. He tries to attack her back, but the sword breaks and he's in some dire straits. She's a formidable opponent. And it says here, the son of Ecgtheow would have surely perished, and the Geats lost their warrior under the wide earth, had the strong links and locks of his war gear not helped to save him. Holy God decided the victory. So there's that insertion of that Christian promise that God helped him win because he was on the side of right and good, and the monster is of Cain's clan, so she's going to perish. There's a section where Beowulf loses his weapon, and Grendel's mother has a little knife that she's stabbing him with. And let me just highlight that part. And this is a term that I want to mention, but it's not something that's going to show up on your midterm. Maybe you've heard this term before. It's Deus ex machina. This is a literary term that means literally God in the machine. And that's kind of what happens with Beowulf in this story. It's a little hard to believe. As he's there pinned down by Grendel's mother and fighting with her, he doesn't have a weapon anymore. And he happens to look over, and in her armory is this enormous sword, this detailed sword, and he grabs it. It's huge. It's called the Sword of the Giants. And he is able then to completely decapitate her with that sword. It's like magical. So the idea that this sword just sort of magically appears and is the thing that he needs to defeat her is this God in the machine. Deus ex machina means that the plot problem is solved by sort of an unbelievable intervention. You know, if a writer gets themselves into a corner and they can't solve it, it'll be like, and then she woke up and it was all a dream. You know, that's a Deus ex machina device in use. And so, you know, he finds this sword. It's kind of hard to believe that that sword that will kill her would be right there. But he turns around and he beheads her. He goes and he finds the body of Grendel, beheads that, and takes two things up to the surface. Do you remember what they are? The two things that he brings with him? Think. Grendel's head. He had wanted Grendel's head and only got the arm, so now he's got the head. Grendel didn't put up a fight. He was already dead. And the hilt of the sword, because the sword that Beowulf uses to kill Grendel's mother, the blade of it melts because of the blood of these creatures is toxic and it melts. And so he's just got the handle of the giant sword and Grendel's head. And he swims up. I don't know how you swim up with a big old monster head and a big old sword handle, but he does. He swims back up to the top and breaks the surface and is victorious. So here's a description of how the sword melted, and it says, into gory icicles. There's a lot of really good description in this story. And I think at first when you read it, you're kind of like, it's old and it's going to be boring. But then some like really interesting stuff happens with the battles and all of that. I don't know. I think that sustains it for most people. Okay, so then after he gets up there, he gets in and explains to Hrothgar what was going on. Here's another spot that you got to skip. Obviously, they have another big old party. Good thing that there's not uncles and cousins and all kinds of other family members to come and keep avenging Grendel's mother is the end of it. But Beowulf is victorious and they celebrate that. Hrothgar gives him a little bit of a lecture from his experience, and he says, don't let this get a big head. Don't start thinking that you're immortal. Let me give you a line for that. He's talking about the sword that's there and so on and so forth. He talks about some previous king. So learn from this and understand true values. I who tell you have wintered into wisdom. And we see the things that Hrothgar tells him at this point in play at the end of Beowulf, because Beowulf kind of turns into Hrothgar in that he's a great warrior who is old and has to defend his people. Hrothgar's unsuccessful at that. Beowulf is successful, but part of the advice that Hrothgar gives him at this point plays out at the end, right? He says, God gave us wisdom, but there are, no matter how great you are, a killer stalks you. And that killer is death, right? At some point, something is going to come and kill you. And that is something that you shouldn't forget, that your mortality. Beware that trap and go for eternal rewards. So here's an intercession of the idea of Christianity. And there's a little subtle conversion technique going on here. Hrothgar says, give all of your glory to God and you will live past that killer, of death. If you don't, then you're just going to die. So it's moving from the pagan idea to the Christian afterlife idea, if you live your life according to God. So there's a little bit of a lecture where Hrothgar suggests that Beowulf not become prideful and try to be a good Christian boy. This is still just a summary of the part that you haven't read. Beowulf goes back home. He greets his king, Hygelac. He gives all the treasures to Hygelac. He explains to Hygelac how he killed Grendel, how he killed Grendel's mother. He's very faithful in his description of what happens. He almost downplays it in a situation where he could exaggerate and make himself sound better than he really was, even better. He doesn't, and he just sort of tells the king what happened. And the king gives him some of the stuff, but takes most of it into the treasury, gives him a little bit of land. And let me see, that brings us to the point where you are going to pick up. And then we'll go to the end. So this is where he's describing to the king all of the things that he received. And then you should have picked up on the dragon wakes section here. I don't know why the font is a little different in this PDF right here, but it's a little harder to read. Hopefully it's okay on your end, but okay, so once Beowulf gets back and brings all of his treasures to his king and explains to him what happened, time expands, and all of a sudden we shoot forward many, many years, and just with the line, a lot was to happen in later days in the fury of battle. And so there's a little description. Hygelac dies, the next king dies, the next king after that dies, and then Beowulf becomes king. A lot of what's in here is flashback explaining how that happens, how Beowulf ends up being king. Because if you go to that family tree that I set up here for you, hopefully that's helping you as you're figuring out who's who when you're reading. Beowulf is related to the king. He's his nephew. Whoa. A little bit more. Okay. I pointed this out the other day. Beowulf is the nephew of Hygelac, the current king. So when Hygelac dies, he dies in battle. His brother Hæthcyn becomes king. Now, Hæthcyn becomes king instead of Herebald because Herebald died. Hæthcyn killed him in an accident. It was like a archery accident. And so there's a reference to Rethel being really upset about that in the part that you read because he's grieving his son. But anyway, so Cathkin becomes king. He dies in battle. And then there's a debate because Hygelac son, Hardred, is young. And they don't really want to make him king because he's too young and inexperienced. And so they offer the throne to Beowulf. But Beowulf refuses. He says it's not the right way to go. It's not his time to be king. There's somebody else in line. So he offers to mentor Hardred. He said, let's make Hardred king. I'll mentor him into his position. And so he does. And then Hardred dies. The reason I'm mentioning all this is because I want to talk about how old Beowulf is by the time the dragon shows up. So let's go through it. If Beowulf is, let's just say on the low end, 20 when he goes to Denmark and kills Grendel and Grendel's mother, that's probably low, but let's just say 20, just for easy math. He goes home, all these other people are king before him. That's at least another 10, maybe 15 years, right? So he's maybe 30, 35 by the time he becomes king. Then he's king for 50 years, 50 very quiet years. So that puts him at 75, 80 years old by the time the dragon shows up at the end. And when he's having that battle with the dragon, he's like 85. I don't know if you know many 85-year-olds, but I know a couple, and they are not ready for dragon battle. They've really been, taking it easy. um, so the idea is that if Beowulf can defeat the dragon, he is truly great indeed. So this section right here does a lot of flashback explaining how Beowulf came to the throne, because once Beowulf gets on the throne, there's no more battles. Nobody wants to fight Beowulf, so they have 50 years of peace. Beowulf, with all of his legend, nobody wants to attack that, so he keeps his people safe and happy for 50 years. And then this dragon shows up. There's a little bit of an origin story about the dragon. He, a long, long time ago, this guy, they call him the last man. You can see on line 2247 where that's mentioned. He, this last survivor of his people showed up and put the remaining treasure of his civilization into this cave. He's the last guy, they're dying out, so he puts his treasure in there and goes away. This is a little bit of foreshadowing, by the way, and I'll pick that up later on, but the dragon comes by whenever later and says, oh, this would be a comfy place to live. I guess dragons like, bling. So he moves in to the cave, and the dragon calls the treasure his own and lives there for many generations. But there's this problem. The dragon is disturbed by this thief who comes in and takes a goblet. And this angers the dragon. And so now Beowulf has to deal with the awakening of this dragon. And the dragon is angry, dive bombing the city, burning stuff up because dragons have that fire breath. And so now this is the part where the dragon is taking ownership of the treasure and the hoard. And now he's scorching the ground and all of that sort of thing and threatening the lives and the safety of Beowulf's people. So there's a description of how he goes around at night, sort of inflaming all of the city and burning everything to the ground, and nobody can really do anything about it. And his hate and anger. Beowulf doesn't know what to do. At first, he's not that concerned because, it's kind of like, I've been through a lot before. I've seen creatures, I've killed creatures, et cetera, et cetera. And so he's not worried at first, but then the monster goes ahead and there's like an enormous, do you hear that helicopter? Oh, is the president coming to McAllen today? I think today's the... I think the president just flew over my house. I don't know. I don't know if you guys could hear it, but it was shaking my house. Some helicopters. Where was I? Oh, okay. So Beowulf decides he's going to fight the dragon to rid the people of him. Now that's a weird thing for an 85-year-old to decide to do. I'm looking for this spot. But he says, many a skirmish I survived when I was young, and many times of war. When I was 7, I was an orphan. You know, it's kind of like when old people say, suck it up. I had it way worse than you did. I had to do this and that and the other thing. And, you know, I had to walk 20 miles to school and no shoes and stuff like that. So they go back and forth, and this is a lot of the flashback stuff where they talk about the death of Heribald and all of that sort of thing. And he went through all of that with Hrethel. And so then he finally decides that he's going to go after the dragon. In this section, Beowulf attacks the dragon. He makes this formal boast, just like he did before each one of the other creatures that he killed. And so he says, he admits he's old, but he says, I'm going to fight by myself. That is pretty bold, even for a hero, but he's old. And so he says he's going to fight the dragon. And he tells his men, you guys wait over there on the side. Why does he do that? Well, it heightens his legend if he can kill the dragon by himself, because he killed the other creatures by himself. So it kind of helps if his legend is unmarred by assistance. It doesn't work out that way. One guy starts to help him, but he tells all of these other men to wait over on the side. He says, the fight is not yours, nor is it up to any man except me to measure his strength against the monster or to prove his worth. I shall win the gold by my courage. So he wants to beat the dragon, but he also wants to get the treasure. He thinks it's going to help his people after he dies to have it, you know, in that treasury. So he then goes in to start fighting the dragon, and it's not easy. You can't even really get that close to the dragon because the dragon has that fire breath. So he's able to try to stab at the dragon, but it doesn't work. The scales on the dragon are impenetrable. So the king of the Geats raised his hand and struck hard at the enameled scales, but scarcely cut through. So Beowulf is not being very victorious in this battle at first. He is, you know, his shield gets really hot, and he's unable to fight back against the dragon. It looks like he's losing, when one of the soldiers on the sidelines, Beowulf, sees Beowulf's problem. And he remembered, it says here, when he saw his lord tormented by the heat of his scalding helmet, he remembered the bountiful gifts bestowed on him, how well he lived among the Waegmundings. So it's about how much Beowulf had given to him, and he's like his hero. So he wants to go in and help him, and he decides to do that. But before he does, he tries to get some of the other men to come with him, and the spectators there, and they won't, but he tries to do it. He tries to tell them, look, this guy gave you everything you have, all of your happiness, it's because of this king, and he gave us all these gifts in the mead hall so that we would have allegiance to him, and now's the time for us to prove our allegiance, you know. And he's kind of like, let's go. I would rather my body were robed in the same burning blaze as my gold giver's body than to go back home bearing arms. I don't care if I die, if I'm dying, you know, helping Beowulf. Ah! And so he goes running out there, and he's the only one. All the rest of them stay behind. And but he does help Beowulf. I think it's debatable, but I think without Beowulf, I don't think Beowulf would have been able to kill the dragon, because he comes to Beowulf and he says, I'm here to stand by you. And he stabs the dragon in his underbelly, and that distracts the dragon, and Beowulf's able to give the dragon the death blow. but not before the dragon bites Beowulf on the neck. So Beowulf gets not just the puncture wounds and the blood, spurts out of his neck, but also he gets venom. Apparently, dragons are venomous, so the poison goes into his blood system. He doesn't die immediately, but he has this last moment where he's able to stab the dragon and deliver the mortal wound to the dragon. The dragon dies, but Beowulf is dying. And his last two thoughts are of his funeral and the treasure that he has just won for his people. He has Beowulf go and get the treasure and bring it to him because he wants to see it. And he also talks about how he wants to be buried. So Beowulf runs off and gets the treasure, and Beowulf dies thinking that he has saved his people. He hasn't. They buried the treasure with him. And it's obvious that attack is imminent, especially from the Swedes at the end. Beowulf thought that they might be able to pay them off with this treasure and his people would be safe, but because they bury a huge amount of it with him in his barrow, they inevitably, it doesn't say it in the text, but inevitably got absorbed by the Swedes. That's why we have Sweden today and we don't have Geatland. Geatland was in the bottom part of what is now Sweden, so they just absorb the Geats. So Beowulf goes and he gets the treasure, he brings it back, he shows it to Beowulf, and Beowulf prays, and here he starts talking about how he wants to be buried on a cliff overlooking the sea so that when people go by they can say, oh, there's Beowulf's burial spot. And then there's his funeral. Beowulf's funeral is different from the funeral of Shield that we saw at the beginning of the book. At the beginning of the book, we open with the funeral of Shield Chieftain, who's put in a boat and set to sea. Beowulf is burned on a funeral pyre, cremated. The way that happens, before that happens, Beowulf goes and tells off all of the shirkers. They call them the shirkers because they shirked their responsibility to be loyal to Beowulf, and he really lets them have it because he's angry. He says, this is the man that gave you everything. So it is goodbye now to all you know and love on your home ground. The open-handedness, the giving of war swords. In other words, there's not anybody left to give you these gifts anymore that you took for granted and didn't even repay. Every one of you with freeholds of land, our whole nation will be dispossessed once princes from beyond get tidings of how you turned and fled and disgraced yourselves. If you had fought, at least maybe people would think that we're fierce warriors. But as soon as word gets out that you didn't even help Beowulf defeat the dragon, they're going to come and attack us and get everything. They're going to take our land and kill us. So thanks a lot, shirkers. So he really lays into them, gives them this big old guilt trip. And he talks about how there's this threat from the Swedes. I'm summarizing this part here. And they're going to come and take us because... Now you could argue that Beowulf could have done more to train them. He could have done, like, left an heir. There's no Beowulf Jr. There's no word of that. So there's nobody to take his place. And I guess they didn't think about that back then. So Beowulf didn't fulfill any kind of succession element. But there's this idea that they need to go ahead and take care of his funeral, and they put him on a funeral pyre, which I have an image of it in here. What was that I just passed? Oh, they go and see his body. Beowulf sort of oversees the funeral. A funeral pyre, here's an image of one. I'll put it in the middle here so you can see it. So it's a structure that's built so that everybody can see the cremation of the person who's being honored with the pyre. So the person's body would be here and then it would be burnt. It takes many, many hours for that to happen at a fire rate. It's basically a cremation. So you can see that people watch it and pay their respects. It's part of the funeral ritual. So they burned Beowulf, and his wishes were to be laid in a barrow. I put an image of a barrow here too, because that's not super common. They would build up mounds to make a sort of artificial hill and then reinforce the inside with you know, timbers and mud and hay and things like that to create like a space inside the structure, and then leave the remains of the person and their belongings and treasure or weapons, whatever they happen to have in there. Over the years, most of these barrows have been discovered and plundered, and people got all the stuff out of it. But you can still see them today. They still exist in Northern Europe and England. Just a visual. So they construct this mound, and that's where they're going to put the hero's memorial. And the piece ends with his funeral concluding, and the line, "They said that of all the kings upon earth, he was the man most gracious and fair-minded, kindest to his people, and keenest to win fame." Well, that's for sure. So end of story, roll the credits. That's the end of Beowulf. I don't see anything over here in the chat. Anything? I know I went kind of quickly through a few of the things, so if there's anything that I didn't talk about that you want me to, you can put it in there. I'll take a couple minutes to talk about Thursday's class. On Thursday, we're moving on to the Middle Ages. And in that lecture, I will be talking about the first part of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. There are 4 parts to that piece. You're reading part 1 for Thursday and part 4 for next Tuesday. So I'll go over part 1 on Thursday. On Friday, I'm not going to be continuing with Gawain. That's going to be for next Tuesday. But this is a B week, so I will have a class if you want to come on Friday. And basically, we'll be going over some study questions from Beowulf and from Sir Gawain. And also, I'll be talking about the first discussion, which is due next Friday. I'll share with you the topic and the expectations that have been set up for your ability to do those discussions. Blackboard should be available to you starting Monday, hopefully. So class is officially started STC on Tuesday. But everything's laid out here. Week 3, we should be in Blackboard by then, but I listed it here just in case, and in case anybody has trouble getting into Blackboard or there are any issues. We're good through next week. And after that, we'll be transferring over to the Blackboard platform. All right, I don't see anything in the chat, so I'm going to assume that everybody's good. Hopefully this discussion of the second part of Beowulf was helpful to you. I tried to keep it energetic. If you have questions, you can certainly stick around afterwards, and I'll be glad to help you with them. Otherwise, hopefully I'll see you on Thursday. Have a good day.